Tonight we begin with a scene that feels like something out of a political thriller, except it's happening in the United States right now. James Comey, the former director of the FBI, the man fired by Donald Trump in one of the defining moments of his first presidency, walked into a federal courthouse in Virginia today and pleaded not guilty to 2 felony charges, providing false statements and obstructing a congressional proceeding. If convicted, he could face up to 5 years in prison. But the real story tonight is not about what happened inside that courtroom. It's about what led us there and what this prosecution represents. Comey's attorney, Patrick Fitzgerald, one of the most respected federal prosecutors in modern American history, told the judge something that landed like a thunderclap. This prosecution was brought by President Trump. Let's just pause on that. Not by the Department of Justice. Not by an independent U.S. attorney. By President Trump. Those were Fitzgerald's words in open court. And what he was saying, in plain English, is that this is not a normal criminal case. This is the President of the United States directing his Justice Department to prosecute his personal enemies. Now, Comey's defense team is filing at least 5 motions to try to dismiss this case before it ever reaches a jury. One will allege outrageous government conduct. Another will challenge the legality of the prosecutor herself, Lindsay Halligan, a former White House aide with no prior experience as a federal prosecutor, installed just 3 days before she presented this case to a grand jury. Others will argue that the case is vindictive, selective, and politically motivated, a claim that's not hard to believe when you remember that this same president publicly called for Comey's prosecution on social media. Trump wrote to his Attorney General, Pam Bondi, last month. "We can't delay any longer. It's killing our reputation and credibility. They impeached me twice, indicted me 5 times, over nothing. Justice must be served now." That's not the language of a president seeking impartial justice. That's the language of a man demanding retribution, and it's not happening in isolation. This is part of a broader, deliberate pattern, one that stretches back to Trump's very first months in office, when he demanded loyalty from Comey, was denied it, and then fired him for investigating Russian interference in the 2016 election. Now, 8 years later, the same man who weaponized the Justice Department against his critics has done it again, this time with his former FBI director as the target. Let's be clear about what that means. When a sitting president uses the machinery of justice prosecutors, grand juries, and indictments to go after those who investigated or opposed him, that's not law enforcement. That's vengeance disguised as justice. And it's happening right now under the color of law inside an American courtroom. The stakes couldn't be higher. Because this case isn't just about James Comey. It's about whether the rule of law in this country can survive being turned into a political weapon. The former director of the FBI, a man who once led investigations into organized crime, counterterrorism, and public corruption, now stands accused by the very government he once served. And the prosecutor leading that case was handpicked by the president himself, bypassing the Senate, and possibly exceeding her legal authority to even be there. So the question tonight is simple and terrifying. If this is what happens to the FBI director who defied Trump, what message does it send to every other public servant who might be thinking about standing up to him now? That's where we begin. What's unfolding in Virginia tonight is not just a courtroom drama, it's a roadmap. A roadmap of how power, once unleashed without restraint, rewrites the boundaries of justice. Let's start with the prosecutor. Lindsay Halligan, the woman now leading the case against Comey, is not a career attorney at the Department of Justice. She's not a veteran federal prosecutor with years of experience handling complex national security cases. She was a White House aide, a Trump loyalist, parachuted into one of the most sensitive prosecutorial seats in the country, the Eastern District of Virginia, just 3 days before she presented Comey's indictment to a grand jury. Her appointment was made under the temporary interim U.S. attorney provision, but even that seems shaky. That position can last only 120 days without Senate confirmation, and by most legal accounts, that limit has already expired. Yet, somehow, Halligan remains in place long enough to bring criminal charges against one of Trump's most visible enemies. Comey's legal team plans to challenge her appointment outright, arguing that her very presence in the courtroom violates federal law. And they may have a point. Because in this administration, legality has become something negotiable, something stretched and molded to fit whatever political aim happens to be convenient at the moment. But the bigger picture here is even more alarming. Look at the pattern. First, you remove the guardrails, purge the independent prosecutors, the inspectors general, the career officials who might resist you. Then you replace them with loyalists, people who owe their position not to the law, but to you personally. Then you pick your targets. It's the same pattern we've seen again and again. The Trump administration has already gone after New York Attorney General Letitia James, who investigated his business empire. It's gone after the FBI officials who signed off on surveillance warrants. It's gone after journalists who published leaks. And now it's James Comey, the man whose firing helped trigger the special counsel investigation that dogged Trump's first presidency. Each case has its own veneer of legality, an indictment here, a grand jury there, but when you step back, the pattern is unmistakable. This is not justice. This is retaliation in motion. And think about the timing. The trial date is set for January 5th, just days before the anniversary of January 6th. The symbolism is impossible to ignore. While the country remembers the attack on the Capitol, the administration will be staging another spectacle of power, this time not with rioters, but with prosecutors and judges. They'll say it's about law and order, but in truth, it's about rewriting the narrative of accountability, turning the enforcer into the villain and the accused into the avenger. And even now, Trump is not pretending otherwise. He's posting in all caps, demanding action, naming his targets publicly. He's doing what autocrats have always done, using the visibility of punishment as a warning to others. Because what's the point of prosecuting James Comey, if not to remind every other federal official, every whistleblower, every inspector general, every prosecutor watching that the cost of crossing this president is criminal prosecution? That's the real purpose of this trial. It's not about what James Comey did or didn't say in his 2020 testimony. It's about the chilling message it sends. If you stand up to me, I will find a way to make you pay. That is not the language of democracy. That's the language of intimidation from a White House that's learned it can weaponize the justice system and still call it fair. And that's where we'll pick up with the question of what this case means, not just for James Comey, but for the entire system of justice in America that's now being twisted to serve one man's obsession with revenge. What's remarkable about the Comey prosecution, and I use that word deliberately, is how thin the case itself actually is. Here's what it boils down to. Prosecutors say that during his 2020 congressional testimony, James Comey lied when he said he had not authorized anyone to leak classified information to the press. That's it. That's the crux of the criminal charge. The government claims that he, in fact, allowed someone identified only as person 3 in the indictment to be an anonymous source in news reports about an FBI investigation. That person 3 is believed to be Daniel Richman, Comey's longtime friend and law professor at Columbia University. Richman had once served as a special government employee for the FBI. In other words, this is not some rogue whistleblower funneling secret nuclear codes to the media. It's an academic who had, for years, been publicly known as one of Comey's close advisors, someone who occasionally helped him interpret complex legal issues during his tenure. And yet, this is what the Trump Justice Department has decided to treat as a felony. To call it selective prosecution would be an understatement. Because if this is the new standard, if every official who ever authorized a communication to the press is now a potential felon, then we would be filling prisons with cabinet secretaries, press officers, and senior aides from every modern administration. Even the government's own filings betray the weakness of the case. Prosecutors admit they don't yet know how they'll handle classified information in court. The Justice Department's lead attorney was chastised by the judge this week for not being prepared to explain how evidence involving classified documents would be used at trial. Judge Michael Nachmanoff told both sides, "I'm not going to let things linger." He wants the evidence turned over quickly, and he made it clear the government is under enormous pressure to figure out how it intends to handle that material. That kind of judicial impatience, that let's move this along tone, usually signals that a judge smells politics. And in this case, how could he not? Remember, this is the same James Comey whose firing Trump once bragged about on television, saying it had relieved great pressure over the Russia investigation. The same Comey whose notes his contemporaneous memos became evidence in the Mueller probe. So now, years later, those same notes, that same honesty that once served as a public record of presidential misconduct, are being flipped into the foundation for his own indictment. It's almost poetic. in the bleakest, most cynical sense. And here's another point worth emphasizing. This is not the Justice Department operating on autopilot. This is not some career prosecutor quietly following the evidence wherever it leads. The DOJ's own internal politics have been warped around this case. One interim U.S. attorney actually resigned after refusing to bring charges against Comey and New York Attorney General Letitia James under presidential pressure. That's how we got Lindsay Halligan in the first place, a political appointee chosen precisely because she would say yes where others said no. The message from the top was clear. You don't get to walk away from this job with your independence intact. You do what the president wants, or you're out. And that's the defining feature of authoritarian justice systems, the transformation of legal discretion into personal obedience. Even the timeline feels orchestrated. A January 5th trial set to play out just before the anniversary of January 6th, a symbolic inversion of accountability. Instead of the architects of insurrection facing judgment, we're watching the man who investigated them being marched into court. In a nation that once prided itself on separating politics from prosecution, this moment reads like a warning shot. Truth itself can be criminalized if it embarrasses the wrong person. And for James Comey, that person happens to be the President of the United States. Let's talk about what this case actually does, not just to James Comey, but to the system itself. Because this isn't really about proving guilt. It's about sending a message. When you prosecute a former FBI director, a man who once sat at the top of the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country, you're not just putting him on trial. You're putting every other potential dissenter on notice. You're saying, if we can do this to him, we can do it to you. That's how political intimidation works. Not by winning in court, but by chilling everyone outside it. And the fear doesn't just spread horizontally through the ranks of public servants. It spreads vertically through the institutions that are supposed to check presidential power. The Justice Department, the courts, Congress, the press. Each one learns the same lesson. Independence carries risk. You start to see it in the language officials use, the evasive phrasing, the cautious silences, the carefully non-committal press statements that say everything and nothing. That's how institutions die, not in one grand collapse, but in the quiet normalization of fear. When the president handpicks prosecutors to pursue his enemies, when he names them on social media and demands justice now, when he installs loyalists in place of career attorneys, what he's really doing is eroding the invisible line between the rule of law and the rule of man. That line is what keeps us a democracy. It's what separates the United States from every country where justice means whatever the leader wants it to mean. And right now, that line is being erased one indictment at a time. And you can see it in how this case echoes others. What happens if this case goes forward, even if it fails, is almost beside the point. Because the damage has already been done. The precedent has already been set. For decades, Americans took for granted that federal law enforcement was insulated, at least somewhat, from raw political influence. That there were norms, boundaries, ethics, rules, and institutional backstops that prevented any one president from using the FBI or the DOJ like his personal legal team. But those norms aren't written in the Constitution. They're habits, fragile habits, sustained only by the belief that no leader would dare violate them so brazenly. Well, that belief has been shattered. And once that fear takes root, once every agent, every prosecutor, every journalist starts asking, what will happen to me if I cross him? It doesn't matter how many press conferences the administration holds about law and order. The system has already internalized the fear. And fear, once normalized, doesn't go away. It metastasizes. The ultimate goal of a weaponized justice system isn't to punish everyone who resists. It's to make sure fewer people resist at all. And that's why the Comey case is so dangerous, not just for what it alleges, but for what it teaches. It tells future presidents, future autocrats, that this can be done, that you can turn the machinery of justice into a tool of political control, and the country will still call it law. That's the real precedent being set here. And it's one that, once established, will be almost impossible to undo. What we're seeing in the James Comey prosecution is not just a one-off political feud. It's the culmination of a long project. A years-long effort to dismantle the neutral architecture of American justice and rebuild it in the image of a single man's grievances. And the way you know it's deliberate is how quietly it's being done. Step 1, you hollow out the institution. Step 2, you fill the hollowed-out spaces with loyalists. Step 3, you redefine the words that once constrained you, law, truth, justice, until they mean whatever you need them to mean. In the Trump administration's second term, that process has accelerated. It began with the purge of independent prosecutors, the forced resignations of inspectors general, the intimidation of journalists. And now, with the Comey case, we're watching what happens when the shell of the system is turned outward to punish those who used to protect it. Now, 7 years later, the reckoning has arrived. Comey stands accused of the very thing Trump's own allies have done openly for years, leaking information to shape public perception. The difference is that when loyalists do it, it's whistleblowing. When critics do it, it's treason. That asymmetry, that double standard, is how authoritarian systems enforce loyalty. It's not that the rules change, it's that they apply differently depending on who you are. And look at how the administration has timed everything. The arraignment takes place just as new federal restrictions on the press are being rolled out at the Pentagon restrictions that will require journalists to sign pledges before reporting on unclassified information. The same week, the FCC chairman threatens to revoke broadcast licenses for networks that criticize the government. Each move is small enough to justify individually. Together, they form a pattern, a campaign to choke the flow of information until truth itself is something the government owns. The Comey prosecution fits perfectly into that design. If you can criminalize an FBI director for what he said in sworn testimony, you can criminalize anyone who contradicts the official narrative. If you can convince the public that defending democracy is the same as lying to Congress, then you've turned truth into a political crime. And that's the deeper danger here. Because once the machinery of justice is rewired for revenge, it doesn't stop at the powerful. It trickles down. It starts catching journalists, analysts, bureaucrats, soldiers, anyone who touches a classified file or writes an inconvenient memo. The power to indict becomes the power to intimidate. And in that environment, self-censorship becomes the survival instinct of the bureaucracy. That's the goal. Not to win every case, but to teach everyone in government what happens when you cross the line. And while the administration frames all this as restoring fairness or holding the deep state accountable, it's really about inversion flipping reality until the arsonists call themselves firefighters. We've seen this movie before. In other countries, in other decades. Democracies rarely die with tanks in the street. They die with subpoenas, loyalty oaths, and televised trials of former officials meant to show the public that resistance is futile. That's what this is, a demonstration. The trial of James Comey is not just about an alleged false statement in 2020. It's about rewriting the story of who gets to define justice in 2025. And if this experiment works, if the public accepts that law enforcement itself can be prosecuted for disloyalty, then every future president will have a precedent for turning the justice system into a personal security force. That's the machinery being tested right now. And whether or not it convicts James Comey, it's already convicting the very idea of independent justice. There's a sound that repeats itself across history when democracies begin to buckle. It's not the sound of explosions or marching boots, it's the quieter echo of power being centralized, the steady, almost bureaucratic hum of institutions adjusting themselves to a new reality. That's what you hear in the Comey case. Not a roar, not a coup, but the low, procedural grind of an administration normalizing the extraordinary, redefining criminality, repurposing the courts, and repackaging vengeance as law. Think of what's actually being normalized here. You have a sitting president openly demanding the prosecution of his perceived enemies. You have an attorney general carrying out those orders under the banner of equal justice. You have a federal court being used as a stage for political theater, and an entire Justice Department forced to operate like a campaign machine. This isn't an accident. It's not a series of uncoordinated moves. It's a playbook. Because if you want to control the narrative of a nation, you don't start with the headlines, you start with the people who write them. If you want to erase accountability, you don't begin with the press, you begin with those who investigate. And if you want to make sure no one ever challenges power again, you start by making an example out of the one man who once did. James Comey isn't just a former FBI director on trial. He's a symbol being repurposed, a cautionary tale for anyone in the federal bureaucracy who might still believe that the law should outlast the leader. That's why this case is so performative. Every motion, every hearing, every leak to the press is part of a spectacle designed to communicate control. The president doesn't need a conviction, he needs a precedent. He needs a visual, a courtroom, a defendant, a headline that proves disloyalty carries consequences. When prosecutors are chosen for loyalty instead of expertise, when trials are timed for maximum political effect, when the president can accuse and the courts will obey, that's not justice. That's hierarchy masquerading as law. And yet, notice how subtle it is. The administration doesn't outlaw dissent. It litigates it. It doesn't ban criticism. It criminalizes it through false statements and obstruction. It doesn't seize the press. It forces them to sign loyalty agreements, one press badge at a time. This is how democracy erodes in the 21st century, procedurally, politely, legally. So when people say, oh, this is just Comey's problem, they're missing the point. Because if the law can be weaponized against him, it can be weaponized against anyone who stands between power and truth. And that includes journalists, judges, whistleblowers, and yes, even ordinary citizens who dare to expose what's happening behind the curtain. The echo of power, the slow closing of institutional doors, that's what we're hearing now. And the longer we let it resonate unanswered, the louder it becomes. Because what begins as a single prosecution can end as a permanent condition. A country where fear replaces faith in the rule of law and where justice, once blind, learns to see only the face of power. Here's the truth that history keeps whispering to us, if we're willing to hear it. Authoritarianism never declares itself at the beginning. It creeps in under the fluorescent lights of ordinary courtrooms, under the polite language of due process and national security, until one day you realize the verdict was written before the trial even began. That's what's happening right now. Because no matter how this ends for James Comey, whether he walks free or spends years defending himself in appeal after appeal, the damage is already done. The punishment isn't the conviction, it's the prosecution itself. It's the signal sent to every judge, every reporter, every civil servant. We can make you the story. That's the message. And that message is what corrupts a democracy faster than any coup ever could. When the rule of law becomes an instrument of power, justice stops being a shield. It becomes a weapon. And when that weapon is aimed not at criminals, but at critics, what you have isn't a justice system. It's a warning system. Every subpoena becomes a message. Every indictment becomes a threat. Every televised hearing becomes a spectacle designed not to inform the public, but to remind them who's in charge. And here's the terrifying part. It works. Slowly, quietly, it works. Not through mass arrests or sweeping censorship, but through fatigue, through the normalization of fear, through the small voice inside each of us that whispers, maybe I should stay quiet this time. That's how freedom dies, not all at once, but by degrees. Comey's trial is not just about an alleged false statement from 5 years ago. It's about whether truth itself can survive a government that punishes honesty. It's about whether any official will dare to resist the next illegal order, knowing what happened to the last one who did. And if you're wondering whether this sounds familiar, that's because it should. The same president who demands loyalty from prosecutors, who sues journalists, who redefines press access as privilege, who replaces investigators with loyalists, that president is building a government that fears transparency more than treason. But here's what history also teaches us. Every abuse of power eventually meets its reckoning not through silence, but through exposure. The antidote to authoritarianism has always been the same. Witnesses, people willing to tell the truth, even when the truth is dangerous. James Comey, whatever you think of him, has chosen to stand in court and fight rather than fold. That in itself is an act of defiance, one that forces the system to look itself in the mirror. Because what's really on trial here isn't Comey's integrity, it's the Justice Department's, it's the presidency's, it's ours. And if this nation still believes in the Constitution, if we still believe that no man, not even the president, can twist the law into his personal vendetta, then this trial is our test. The question before us isn't just, is James Comey guilty? The question is, can the law still tell the difference between justice and revenge? And the answer, the real verdict, won't come from a jury in Virginia. It will come from us, from whether we choose to look away or to stand up and say, this is not who we are. Because the moment the people stop caring who the government prosecutes, that's the moment the government stops fearing the people. And that, more than any verdict, is how democracies fall.